Originally inspired by European myths and folklore, the fantasy genre is an enormous and expansive thing. A world of infinite possibilities that almost paradoxically also has a set selection of rules and tropes that people expect to see. And since everything that could ever be said has already been said about things like The Lord of the Rings, the Earthsea series, and the Gormenghast trilogy, I'm going to focus on fantasy books that some people might not have read, that might go under the radar a little bit, or that I just personally absolutely adore and want to talk about. Here are some of my favourite fantasy books of all time, most of which are pretty modern, as in written within this current century. First off, we have The Priory of the Orange Tree by Samantha Shannon, which until recently was a standalone fantasy epic, and that's quite a rare thing, especially for high fantasy. As you can tell by its size, it is an absolutely colossal thing. This is true epic fantasy. It pays an enormous amount of homage is that good grammar? To the legacy of epic fantasy, of high fantasy, of medieval castles, magic systems and dragons, and multiple point of view characters. There's so much going on here, but it is also emblematic of the changes in fantasy, the way that fantasy has grown and evolved over time. It is very, very queer inclusive, it's written by a woman, and historically fantasy is a pretty white male dominated genre, and it's also full of twists and turns. It borrows from other genres in really, really fun ways, while, as I said, being a true love letter to the origins and the history of the fantasy genre. This is epic fantasy, this is high fantasy, but it's also something fresh, new, queer, eccentric to a point, and stunning world building, everything you'd expect from a true, beautiful, epic fantasy novel. I said at the beginning that fantasy has a set selection of rules and tropes, and one author that is considered a fantasy author, but who has constantly broken those rules in really fun ways, in spite of being such an enormous name in fantasy, in literature in general, is Neil Gaiman, and my favourite book of his is American Gods. Again, a pretty sizable epic thing, and a standalone novel. I also said at the beginning that fantasy is traditionally inspired by European myths and folklore, and that's also the origin of this book. That's what this is about. This is a book about what would happen if all of the gods from ancient Europe and also parts of the Middle East and Africa all went to war with the things we now worship. When Europeans went over to the Americas, they took with them their gods, but not all of them. Some gods got left behind, and those gods now want a war. This is a road trip across modern-day USA by a British author who moved to the US, and it's a book that really, really casts a new light on so many infamous gods of European mythology. It's so much fun, and it doesn't let up despite its length. Neil Gaiman's incredible. I love this book to bits. This is my absolute favourite Neil Gaiman novel. This is a true, excellent, gritty piece of urban fantasy, blending mythology with modern-day living and modern-day experiences. Urban fantasy at its finest. I really don't want to dig too deep into fantasy without mentioning Terry Pratchett and the Discworld. I am a huge fan of the Discworld, I've talked about it a lot, and the Discworld is an incredible place. Across his lifetime, Terry Pratchett provided us with 41 novels, all set within the same world. And what's most famous about the Discworld is its satire and its humour. Every page of every book is hilarious. His books satirize big political ideas, social dynamics, things like religion, and the police, while also being very, very good, wholesome, clean, cheeky, hilarious, and heartfelt. Terry Pratchett had a lot of love in him, and that love can be seen in everything he wrote. I recently read Guards, which is the first book of the Vimes and City Watch series. The Discworld has 4 or 5 different protagonists, and one of those protagonists is Sam Vimes, captain of the City Watch. The Discworld has one particular massive city, and that city is called Ankh-Morpork, where so much of the action takes place, where the magical university is, and this is a great book to read in order to become introduced to Ankh-Morpork, which in so many ways is the hub of the Discworld, where so much happens. This is also a book about dragons and cults, two staples of the fantasy genre, and like most of the Discworld books, it is a book that satirizes government and the police, and even organized crime. There's a lot going on here, even though it's a beautifully simple narrative. I love the Discworld. If you're a huge fantasy fan, but you have a decent sense of humor, and you want to really, really enjoy the ways that fantasy can be used as an allegory or as political satire, that's what Pratchett did over and over again. His fantasy world was something that he used to satirize our world, the world around us, the things that should change and could be better. I worship this man. The Discworld's incredible. Another wonderful piece of urban fantasy is The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue. V.E. Schwab's books are kind of hit and miss. Some of them I've really enjoyed and some I really haven't. She's okay at writing things that are gothic. She also handles superheroes, and she approaches different forms of fantasy literature in really fun ways, and I think that this is her best book. Again, this is an urban fantasy novel, and it's about a Faustian deal with the devil. We begin in rural France a few hundred years ago with a young woman who doesn't want to get married. She runs out of her village, and she's been told as a child that you can make deals with ancient gods of the land, pagan creatures. And so she does. She does so at a crossroads, but she does it after the sun has set, and that's not when you're supposed to do it. And the thing that she makes a deal with is a hellish devil creature. And the deal she strikes is that she will be free from all human restraints forever, but no one will ever remember her. She will pass through life for hundreds of years, completely invisible. People will see her and talk with her and acknowledge her, and as soon as they turn their back, as soon as they stop looking at her and listening to her, she vanishes from their memory. It's a really, really fun urban fantasy story that reinvents the Faustian deal concept, and I loved it. My favourite fantasy author ever is also one of the most famous and praised and beloved fantasy authors, so I'm not going to spend a long time on her because I could talk forever, and so many of us could. And that's Robin Hobb. Robin Hobb has created an incredible fantasy world and several trilogies within that world. It's genuinely hard for me to pick a favourite, but I'd probably pick The Live Ship Traders, and this isn't that, this is just what I have to hand. What I love about Robin Hobb is that she really manages to blend high fantasy, magic systems, world building, medieval settings, all of the big, expansive, beautiful things that we love about fantasy, with really intimate character writing and interpersonal character dramas. She really loves her characters, and she encourages us to love them too. The family drama, the romances, the betrayal and backstabbing, all of it feels so weighted, it's so grounded, it's so true to life. Big, massive fantasy worlds with very human and grounded concepts. That's what I really love about Robin Hobb. A trilogy that I really adore but I don't have on me is the Broken Earth trilogy, which began with the 5th season. This is a trilogy by N.K. Jemison where each entry in the trilogy won the Hugo Award, which is absolutely insane. N.K. Jemison is a gift to the world of fantasy. The Broken Earth series is unlike anything you'll ever read. It is experimental and strange, but you can see the origin of every choice that she made when it comes to her plotting, her character writing, and her world building. Everything is recognizably fantasy in its origins, while being wholly unique in its execution. It's absolutely incredible. It's set in a very dark and dismal fantasy world that, as the book goes on, reveals itself to be a lot closer to our world. What's unique about this series is that our protagonist is a middle-aged woman and a mother. That's not a typical fantasy protagonist. N.K. Jemison turned the protagonist on its head immediately. That's the first thing that she did. Then you have a strange magic system and a very volatile world, and a world that is shattered. It's so engaging. And like Robin Hobb, Jemison really focuses on her characters and the journeys they go through, the traumas that they feel. Everything that they do is a struggle. It doesn't come easy. There is no chosen one narrative here. It's quite the opposite. This is about people struggling for survival and making change as they go. Jemison really took fantasy and turned it into something bigger, almost more important than anything it had ever been before. I'm so grateful to her. I really, really am. Another series that I love so much, and I would call it my hidden gem. This is the series that so many people haven't read, and I have recommended it to people in the past. I love it so much. Is The Tales of the Ketty J by Chris Wooding, which began with Retribution Falls. This is a series of 4 novels that follow an airship called the Ketty J and its crew, set in a very delightful, gritty steampunk world. If you're a fan of Cowboy Bebop or Firefly, that's what this series is in so many ways. You have very, very charming, likable anti-hero protagonists, a ragtag group of people who half the time despise each other, an evil pirate queen, people avoiding the law and doing odd jobs for money and trying to get by, while the world is slowly unraveled and built around us. It is hilarious. It hits you surprisingly hard in so many ways. I love the Ketty J series. Not enough people have read it. Please, please check it out. Read Retribution Falls so that I can enjoy having actually spread the word on this incredible series of books. Then there's The Night Circus by Erin Morgenstern, and I just looked everywhere for my copy and I can't find it. And I don't like that. That annoys me. The Night Circus, again, is a clever piece of urban fantasy, historical fiction, and just good old fantasy. It's set in an alternative Victorian world where you have a magician who runs a magical circus called the Night Circus that appears at night very randomly and disappears by dawn, reappearing in other towns and places. The man who runs it is called Prospero, and he has a nemesis, an old friend who's also his enemy, kind of like a Charles Xavier Magneto situation. And the two of them strike up a bet where they each get a protege, an apprentice, and they raise those apprentices to eventually battle it out. It's really, really interesting, and you follow both of these protagonists as they grow up and as they learn magic, and all the while you have this incredible circus as a setting. It's beautiful. I would say the best thing about it is the writing. Morgenstern has an incredible way with words. Her writing is magical. It is beautiful. She really is an eloquent writer. One fantasy author that everyone would expect to see and for me to talk about is Brandon Sanderson. There's a lot of expectation when it comes to reading him. He has a very die-hard selection of fans, a cult of followers. And I avoided reading him for a long time on ethical grounds. He was a missionary, and I don't like that. I'm against the concept of religious missionaries. It is an imperialist concept. It's not a thing I appreciate. And he has openly admitted to saying some really, really homophobic things in the past, having some very conservative views on things like gay marriage. But in recent years, Sanderson has owned up to all of that, and he's proven himself as someone who has openly apologized, admitted what he's done is wrong, and actually tried to make amends for it. And I really respect that. I respect an author who owns up to things that he now sees were mistakes and signs of naivety, and he's working to change and better himself. And so, because I was really happy and really impressed by all of that, I decided to read him. I recently read The Final Empire, the first of the Mistborn series, and I get it. I get why Brandon Sanderson is so beloved. He's a fantastic writer. He's also a very good speaker. I've watched a few YouTube videos and TikToks where he talks about the art of storytelling and craftsmanship, and he really knows his stuff. He's a very wise writer. This is also a really, really satisfyingly political novel. It's set in a world where there is an immortal godlike ruler called the Lord Ruler. He is a dictator who rules over the land, and you have a subclass of Scar people who are slaves and members of the underclass. They are peasants, they are powerless people, and some of them have decided to rise up and try to overthrow the Lord Ruler. And we follow two protagonists as they try to do that. The man who is leading the rebellion, and a young girl who has gotten mixed up in it. And both of them have the same magical powers that are typically only granted to the ruling classes. And these magic powers are really similar to the Force in Star Wars, and the fact that you have a ragtag group of rebels fighting against an empire. Again, it's very Star Wars. I would say that this book, at least, is incredibly Star Wars, which I love. I love Star Wars, so I'm thrilled about that. And Star Wars is far more fantasy than it is sci-fi, so it makes sense. This is very good plotting. Very, very well paced. Sanderson really knows how to create a rhythmic flow to his novels. I'm really impressed by it. Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell is a fantastic novel. It is absolutely huge. It's 1,000 pages long, and it was a debut novel. I love Susanna Clarke. I also loved Piranesi, her second novel. That is one of my favorite books ever. This is a fantastic piece of alternate history, historical fiction with magic about two magic-using wizard men set during the Napoleonic Wars. It is a really fantastic piece of alternate history. I read it a long time ago now. I read it while I was living in Tokyo. It took me 2 weeks to get through. I would read it in between classes when I had a break while I was teaching, and I had so much fun. I have such a wonderful memory of reading this in a really hot Tokyo summer. Oh, it's beautiful. Absolutely beautiful. And it justifies its enormous length as well. I actually didn't want it to end, and that doesn't happen often. For brevity's sake, I am skipping over so many great modern fantasy books like The Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss, which everyone loves, and I love it too. My second favourite fantasy author after Robin Hobb is Joe Abercrombie. His books are incredible grimdark fantasy. They are gritty, they are gnarly. That man is wholly unique in the world of fantasy. I love Joe Abercrombie so much. Start with The Blade itself. It's a fantastic book. But I think I'm just going to finish with Legends and Lattes by Travis Baldry. Oh my goodness, I love this book. I've done a dedicated video talking about it. Fantasy books and D&D go hand in hand, but here, this is a real D&D feeling book. Travis Baldry, who I got to meet when the book came out, said that he is an audiobook narrator and he narrates fantasy books, but he typically likes to read more cozy books, so he blended the two together into a fantasy book about a retired barbarian who decides to open up a coffee shop. And in the city that she opens it up in, no one knows what coffee is. And it's her slowly building and opening up this coffee shop, recruiting people, making friends, cementing herself in the local culture, in the neighborhood. And there is an antagonist. There are high stakes here. I mean, they're small, intimate stakes, but they're high for her. It's such a beautiful novel. It's so well written. It's pretty short, especially as fantasy books go. I really can't talk enough about how lovely and sweet and delightful Legends and Lattes is. Absolutely adore this book. A few honourable mentions go to things like His Dark Materials by Philip Pullman, which were the first books I ever read, the books that got me into reading as a teenager. The Black Magician trilogy by Trudy Canavan. Six of Crows by Leigh Bardugo, which I guess is technically YA fantasy more than adult fantasy. The Beast Player by Nahoko Uehashi is a Japanese novel inspired by Aboriginal Australian mythology. Really, really cool. I've got a written review. I've talked about it in other videos. Go check them out. I loved that book. And its sequel. Also a French trilogy that starts with A Winter's Promise by Christelle Dabos. That's awesome as well, but again, also kind of YA fantasy. I'll stop there, because I could talk about fantasy forever. It's enormous, and I love it. And I've recently fallen back in love with a lot of great fantasy. I'm going to start rereading some Robin Hobb and Joe Abercrombie, my favourites. And I've got a lot of new stuff to check out as well. Fantasy is great, and it's seeing a moment of real change and excitement, a real renaissance of fantasy. It's a good time to be a fantasy fan. So check out what I've said, check out even more, go read my stuff, watch other videos, and subscribe for books.